I learned something important today. A stranger laughed at my body. The deepest wounds are not left by fists. They are left by people who make you question whether you deserve to be seen at all. My name is Grace Walker, and by 7 o'clock on a gray Monday morning, I had already packed my 7-year-old daughter Sophie's lunch, answered 2 overdue utility notices sitting on my kitchen counter, and reminded myself at least 5 times that this new housekeeping job could change our lives if I did not lose it on the first day. Sophie hugged me before climbing onto the school bus, her tiny backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Just before the doors closed, she smiled through the window and pressed both hands against the glass. I smiled back, even though my stomach twisted with worry. Every paycheck already belonged to someone else before I earned it. Rent, groceries, school supplies, the old sedan that begged for repairs every other week. Hope had become the only thing in my life that was still free. 45 minutes later, I stood outside the Callaway estate, a sprawling stone mansion hidden behind towering oak trees and black iron gates that looked more like the entrance to a private resort than someone's home. The driveway curved nearly a quarter mile before reaching the front entrance, where luxury cars rested beneath a covered portico polished enough to reflect the cloudy sky. I adjusted my simple housekeeping uniform, took one slow breath, and reminded myself that cleaning was honest work. Honest work deserved honest pride. Inside, everything smelled faintly of fresh flowers, expensive wood polish, and coffee roasted somewhere deeper in the house. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across marble floors while staff hurried quietly between kitchens, guest suites, and meeting rooms. Nobody wasted movement. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. The head housekeeper handed me a cleaning schedule and pointed toward the east wing. "The owner is hosting a private business luncheon today," she whispered. "Just stay focused and avoid getting in anyone's way." I nodded gratefully and pushed my cleaning cart toward the grand staircase. I had barely begun dusting the carved wooden railing when footsteps echoed across the foyer. Slow, measured, confident. The conversations around me faded almost instantly. I glanced up and saw a tall man descending the staircase in a charcoal suit. The collar of his white shirt left open just enough to reveal dark tattoos stretching above his collarbone before disappearing beneath the fabric. More intricate ink covered part of his forearm, where his sleeve had been casually rolled back. He looked younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with sharp features and calm blue eyes that seemed to notice everything without searching. Nathan Callaway, the owner, the man whose reputation had reached newspapers long before I ever reached his front door. He stopped near the bottom of the staircase and watched as I lifted a heavy storage box onto the cleaning cart. The box slipped slightly before I caught it against my hip. One of the kitchen assistants quietly stepped toward me, but I smiled and assured her I was fine. Nathan's gaze lingered for another second before he spoke. "Is she new?" he asked the head housekeeper. "Yes, sir. Grace Walker. Today is her first shift." His eyes moved over me once, not with curiosity, but with detached judgment. Then, in a voice calm enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said, "She is too overweight to keep up with a house this size. Hire someone who can actually do the job." Nobody laughed loudly. They did not have to. A few lowered their eyes. One server looked away awkwardly. Another employee pretended to organize silver trays that were already perfectly arranged. The silence carried the embarrassment for them. I felt every heartbeat inside my chest, but I refused to let my shoulders fall. I carefully steadied the box, looked directly at the head housekeeper instead of Nathan, and quietly said, "Please show me where you would like me to begin. I came here to work, not to be measured." The words settled over the foyer long after Nathan Callaway had disappeared into the West Wing. Nobody repeated them, yet every person in the room carried them differently. Some pretended they had heard nothing. Others avoided looking at me altogether. I had discovered years ago that embarrassment often made kind people quiet, while cruelty usually made confident people louder. The head housekeeper cleared her throat and gently handed me a pair of white gloves. "The guest suites need fresh linens before noon," she said with an apologetic smile. "If you need help lifting anything, please ask." I nodded gratefully. "Thank you." There was no anger in my voice because anger would not pay my rent. It would not buy Sophie new sneakers or keep the lights on another month. Pride was important, but providing for my daughter mattered even more. I pushed my cleaning cart down the long hallway lined with family portraits and polished walnut doors. Sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking perfectly trimmed gardens, painting warm squares across the hardwood floors. Every room felt larger than the apartment where Sophie and I lived, yet somehow far less alive. Expensive furniture could fill a house, but it could never replace laughter. I quietly changed bedding, dusted bookshelves, and polished mirrors while staff members hurried past carrying flower arrangements and silver serving trays for the afternoon luncheon. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a muffled sound coming from the service staircase. A young kitchen assistant struggled to carry 2 heavy crates filled with bottled sparkling water. One crate slipped against the railing, and she froze, clearly afraid of dropping it. Without thinking, I parked my cart beside the wall and climbed the steps toward her. "Let us do one at a time," I said with a smile. "Nobody wins a race carrying twice the weight." She laughed nervously. "I am already behind schedule." "Then we will both be behind together." We carefully carried the crates downstairs, one trip at a time. When we finished, she wiped her forehead and whispered, "Thank you." Most people would have walked past. I shrugged. Someone once stopped to help me. I am only passing it forward. Before I returned to my work, I noticed movement across the foyer. Nathan stood near the library entrance, speaking with 2 men in tailored suits. He was too far away to hear us, but his eyes lifted for just a second. He watched the young assistant smile as she thanked me again before returning to the kitchen. Our eyes met only briefly. His expression revealed nothing. No approval, no apology, no interest, just observation. I lowered my gaze first and continued toward the guest rooms. Shortly before lunch, my phone vibrated quietly inside my apron pocket. During my scheduled break, I stepped outside onto the rear terrace and answered immediately. Sophie's cheerful voice filled my ear. "Mommy, guess what? I got 100% on my spelling quiz." I closed my eyes and smiled. "I knew you would. Mrs. Harper says I should be proud of myself." She is right. There was a short pause before Sophie asked the question children always asked when they sensed something was wrong. "Are you okay?" I looked across the endless gardens where fountains sparkled beneath the late morning sun. My heart still remembered every word Nathan had spoken, but my daughter did not need to carry that weight with me. "I am okay, sweetheart. Today has been a little difficult, but difficult days do not last forever." Sophie giggled softly. "You always say that." "Because it is always true." As I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket, I did not realize someone standing just inside the open terrace doors had quietly heard every single word. When I slipped my phone back into my apron pocket, I turned toward the hallway and nearly stopped walking. Nathan Calloway stood just inside the open terrace doors, one hand resting loosely against the polished frame. I had been so focused on Sophie's voice that I had never noticed him there. His expression was impossible to read. Calm, reserved, almost distant. For one brief second, I wondered how much he had heard. Then he stepped aside without saying a word, allowing me to pass. I quietly thanked him and continued toward the service corridor. If he had overheard the conversation, he gave no sign of it. By early afternoon, the mansion had transformed completely. Luxury sedans rolled through the front gates every few minutes. Men and women dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers, while soft piano music floated through the ballroom. Caterers carried silver trays filled with carefully prepared appetizers, and fresh flowers filled every corner with the scent of white roses and lavender. I stayed invisible, exactly where housekeeping staff were expected to be. Invisible had become a skill over the years. You learned how to move quietly when life constantly reminded you that people noticed appearances before they noticed effort. As I arranged fresh towels inside one of the guest powder rooms, I heard a quiet sniffle coming from the hallway. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, stood alone beside an enormous window, desperately rubbing tears from his eyes before anyone could see. His expensive suit jacket hung awkwardly from one shoulder, and one of his dress shoes had come untied. I slowly approached without startling him. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked gently. He shook his head but refused to meet my eyes. "I spilled juice on my shirt," he whispered. "My dad is giving a speech. He told me to stay clean." I noticed the faint orange stain across the front of his white shirt. Small, barely noticeable. To a child, it probably felt like the end of the world. I smiled and knelt carefully, so we were almost the same height. "I think we can fix that." From my housekeeping cart, I retrieved a clean cloth and a small stain remover pen. Working slowly, I dabbed the fabric while talking about his bright blue tie covered with tiny sailboats. Within a minute, the stain had almost disappeared. See, I said, sometimes problems only look bigger because they happen to us. The little boy stared at his shirt before a shy smile finally appeared. Thank you. You are very welcome. His father appeared moments later, looking worried until he saw his son smiling again. There you are. The man looked at me, then at the clean shirt. Did you help him? I nodded. It was nothing. He extended his hand anyway. It was something to him. I shook it politely before excusing myself to continue working. As I pushed my cart back into the hallway, I noticed Nathan standing across the ballroom speaking with several business partners. The little boy ran straight toward his father, excitedly pointing back in my direction. While explaining what had happened, Nathan's conversation gradually slowed. His eyes followed the child's small hand until they settled on me once again. This time his expression lingered a little longer than before, not with criticism, but with quiet curiosity, as though the woman he believed he had already judged no longer matched the person he was beginning to observe. The rest of the afternoon should have been forgettable, but somehow every ordinary moment carried a strange weight, as though the mansion itself had started paying attention. I moved quietly from room to room, replacing flowers, polishing antique tables, and collecting empty glasses left behind after the luncheon. Every task reminded me why I was there. Work was simple. People were complicated. Near 3 o'clock, the head housekeeper asked me to deliver fresh tea to the private sitting room on the second floor. Mrs. Calloway is resting, she explained. Just leave the tray inside and return downstairs. I balanced the silver tray carefully and followed the long hallway lined with oil paintings and family photographs. The room overlooking the gardens stood partially open. I knocked softly before stepping inside. An elegant woman with silver hair sat beside the window reading a hardcover novel. She looked up and smiled before I had the chance to introduce myself. You must be Grace. Her voice carried the gentle confidence of someone who never needed to raise it. Yes, ma'am. I placed the tray on the small table beside her chair. Your tea. She thanked me warmly, then noticed a framed photograph that had slipped slightly sideways on the bookshelf behind her. Before I could straighten it, she slowly stood to reach for it herself. The movement was just enough to make her lose her balance for a brief second. Without thinking, I set the tray down and stepped forward, offering my arm. She steadied herself with a grateful smile. Thank you, she said quietly. I moved a little too quickly. It happens to all of us. Once she was comfortable again, I adjusted the photograph and placed it back carefully. It showed a much younger Nathan standing beside his parents near a lake, laughing with a fishing rod balanced across his shoulders. The smile on his face surprised me. It looked completely different from the man who had judged me that morning. He smiled often back then, the older woman said, noticing where my eyes had settled. I immediately looked away. I am sorry. I did not mean to stare. You were not staring. You were wondering. She folded her hands around her teacup. People think my son was born serious. He was not. Before I could answer, a knock came at the door. Nathan entered carrying a folder filled with business documents. He stopped the moment he saw me standing beside his mother. For a brief instant, neither of us spoke. His mother broke the silence first. Grace was kind enough to save me from an embarrassing fall. Nathan looked from her to me, then toward the slightly crooked picture frame I had already straightened. Are you all right? He asked his mother. Perfectly, thanks to her. His eyes returned to mine. There was still restraint in his expression, but the sharp edge I had seen that morning seemed less certain somehow. Thank you, he said simply. I nodded politely. Anyone would have done the same. His mother smiled over the rim of her teacup. No, Grace. Good people always believe that because they cannot imagine choosing otherwise. The room grew quiet again. I excused myself and picked up the empty serving tray, but just before I reached the doorway, I heard Mrs. Calloway speak softly to her son. Nathan, before you decide what someone is worth, you should first notice what they carry when nobody is watching. I did not turn around, but something about the silence that followed told me those words had landed far deeper than either of us expected. Mrs. Calloway's words followed me through every hallway long after I left the sitting room. I kept hearing them between the quiet sounds of polished shoes crossing marble floors and distant conversations drifting from the library. Before you decide what someone is worth, you should first notice what they carry when nobody is watching. I wished life worked that way more often. Most people notice the outside first because it required less effort than understanding the story. Underneath, my afternoon continued with ordinary tasks that somehow felt lighter than they had that morning. I replaced fresh flowers in the guest suites, folded clean towels with careful corners, and helped the kitchen staff prepare the dining room for the evening family dinner. Around 5 o'clock, the pastry chef accidentally dropped an entire tray of freshly baked dinner rolls onto the floor. His face immediately filled with panic. "The second batch is still in the oven," he muttered. "We are going to be late." Without saying a word, I rolled up my sleeves and joined 2 kitchen assistants shaping fresh dough while another employee prepared additional baking pans. Nobody asked whose job it was anymore. We simply worked together until warm bread filled the kitchen with the comforting smell of butter and rosemary. The chef looked at me with grateful eyes. "You were supposed to finish housekeeping an hour ago." I smiled while brushing flour from my apron. "The house is only clean when everyone inside it is doing well." He laughed softly. "Your daughter must be proud of you." The thought warmed me instantly. She is the reason I keep trying. As I carried a basket of fresh bread toward the dining room, I noticed Mrs. Calloway sitting near the fireplace with a family photo album resting across her lap. She waved me over with a gentle smile. "Grace, would you mind helping me for a moment?" I placed the basket on a nearby table before walking over. She carefully turned another page filled with photographs of Nathan as a teenager coaching children during a community baseball fundraiser, smiling beside elderly neighbors at holiday dinners, and standing proudly with scholarship recipients. "He was different," she said quietly. "Success came quickly. Trust disappeared even faster." I studied one photograph showing a much younger Nathan laughing with muddy jeans after helping build a playground. It was difficult to connect that young man with the distant person who had judged me only hours earlier. "People change," I whispered. Mrs. Calloway nodded slowly. "Sometimes because life hardens them. Sometimes because they mistake protection for strength." Before I could answer, footsteps approached from the hallway. Nathan entered carrying another stack of business folders before stopping as he noticed us looking through the album. His mother closed the book with a peaceful smile. "I was reminding Grace that you once smiled without permission." Nathan gave a quiet, almost embarrassed sigh. "Mother." She only chuckled. "It is true." For the first time that day, I saw the faintest hint of amusement touch the corner of his mouth before disappearing almost as quickly as it came. He looked toward me. "Did the kitchen recover?" I blinked in surprise. "You knew?" "The security cameras cover most service areas," he answered calmly. "I saw you helping instead of leaving when your shift had already ended." I lowered my eyes. "They needed another pair of hands." He remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Most people protect their own time first." I shrugged gently. "My daughter reminds me every day that people remember kindness much longer than schedules." Nathan did not reply. He simply watched me with an expression I had not seen before. It was no longer judgment. It was uncertainty, as though the opinion he had formed that morning was slowly falling apart, piece by piece. And for the first time in a very long while, he no longer trusted his own first impression. The mansion finally grew quiet after sunset. The last business guests had gone home. The dining room had been restored to perfect order, and only the soft glow of wall sconces remained to chase away the evening shadows stretching across the marble floors. My shift had officially ended nearly an hour earlier, yet I stayed behind to finish organizing the housekeeping supply room, because tomorrow always became easier when today ended well. I was placing fresh linens onto the highest shelf when I heard my phone vibrate again. Sophie's face appeared on the screen, and the moment I answered, her cheerful voice filled the tiny room. "Mommy, Mrs. Harper let me bring home a sunflower today." I smiled without realizing it. "Did you name it already?" "Of course. His name is Sunny because everybody deserves a happy name." I laughed quietly. "That sounds perfect." There was a short pause before she asked, "Did anybody make you sad today?" Children always seem to ask the questions adults avoided. I leaned against the shelving unit and looked at the folded blankets stacked beside me. "Someone said something unkind this morning." "Did you believe them?" she asked immediately. Her question caught me off guard. "No, sweetheart." "Good," she replied with complete confidence. "Because mirrors and mean people both make mistakes sometimes." My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. "Where did you learn something like that?" Sophie giggled. "You told me after I cried because the girls at school laughed at my glasses." I closed my eyes, suddenly realizing that children remembered our strongest moments even when we forgot them ourselves. Thank you for reminding me. I love you, Mommy. I love you more than every star in the sky. After we ended the call, I remained standing there for another moment, letting the silence settle around me. Then I reached for the light switch and stepped into the hallway. I nearly collided with Nathan. He had been standing several feet away outside the open doorway, one hand resting in his pocket, the other holding a folder he no longer seemed interested in reading. His expression looked different again, less guarded, almost thoughtful. I did not realize anyone was here, I said softly. Neither did I, he answered. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Finally, he spoke again. Your daughter sounds remarkable. I smiled despite myself. She is the best part of my life. He nodded slowly. She asked if you believed what someone said about you. I felt my heartbeat quicken. He had heard enough to understand the conversation. Embarrassment rose inside me. But before I could apologize, he quietly said, she was right. I looked at him, uncertain what he meant. Nathan took a slow breath. Mirrors can be misleading. So can first impressions. His words were calm, but they carried an honesty I had not expected. I searched his face, trying to decide whether this was another judgment or something else entirely. For the first time since we met, his blue eyes held no trace of superiority. Only reflection. Good night, Grace, he said gently. Good night, Mr. Calloway. He turned to leave, then paused without looking back. For what it is worth, I have spent the entire day realizing that I noticed the wrong things first. Before I could answer, he continued walking down the quiet hallway. I watched him disappear around the corner, and for reasons I could not explain, it no longer felt like I had just watched a powerful man walk away. It felt like I had just witnessed the first crack appear in a wall he had spent years building around his own heart. The next morning, I almost convinced myself that the conversation in the hallway had never happened. Life had taught me that apologies were rare, but lasting change was even rarer. People often regretted hurting someone for a moment. Very few chose to become different because of it. The sunrise painted soft shades of gold across the Calloway estate as I pushed my housekeeping cart through the front entrance. The familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen, and the quiet rhythm of another workday settled over the mansion. Staff members greeted me with warmer smiles than they had the day before. The young kitchen assistant waved from across the hallway. The pastry chef held up a basket of fresh cinnamon rolls and proudly announced that nothing had landed on the floor that morning. I laughed with them, grateful that kindness had a way of spreading quietly from one person to another. Around 9 o'clock, the housekeeping supervisor asked everyone to gather briefly in the ballroom before beginning their assignments. The room filled with housekeepers, servers, gardeners, drivers, and maintenance staff, each holding a clipboard while waiting for the day's schedule. I stood near the back, hoping to disappear into the group the way I always did. A few moments later, Nathan walked in carrying a tablet under one arm. Conversation stopped immediately. He thanked everyone for the success of yesterday's charity luncheon before discussing several upcoming events. His voice remained calm and professional, exactly as I remembered. Then he paused. The silence that followed felt different somehow. His eyes slowly moved across the room until they settled on me. My heartbeat quickened. Before we begin today's assignments, he said, there is something I need to address. Nobody moved. Even the gardeners standing near the doors looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Nathan took one slow breath. Yesterday morning, I made a comment about someone working in this house. I felt every pair of eyes turning toward me. My instinct told me to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Nathan continued without looking away. I judged someone by appearance before I bothered to notice character. That was unfair, disrespectful, and beneath the standards I expect from everyone who represents this home, including myself. The room remained completely silent. I could hear nothing except the faint hum of the air conditioning above us. Nathan stepped away from the podium and walked toward where I stood. He stopped a respectful distance away, making certain not to place me in an uncomfortable position. Grace, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I searched his face, expecting to find pride hiding somewhere behind the words. I found none. What I said to you was wrong. There is no explanation that improves it, and I will not insult you by trying to make one. You deserved respect from the moment you walked through these doors. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Nobody had ever apologized to me like that before, especially not in front of other people. I swallowed carefully before answering. Thank you for saying that. He nodded once. Whether you forgive me is your decision. I only wanted to make sure you never questioned whether I understood the mistake. I looked around the ballroom. Nobody pitted me anymore. They simply watched two people choosing honesty over pride. Forgiveness takes time, I said softly. Trust usually takes longer. Nathan accepted the words with a quiet nod. Then I will be patient. For the first time since I had entered the Calloway estate, I realized he was no longer trying to protect his reputation. He was trying to earn something far more difficult, the chance to become the kind of man his own mother still believed he could be. The days that followed did not transform into a fairy tale. Nathan did not suddenly become charming, and I did not suddenly forget the words that had hurt me. Real change rarely happened that way. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, one choice at a time. He stopped interrupting the staff with unnecessary criticism. He began thanking people who stayed late after large events. He learned the names of gardeners who had worked on the estate for years without ever speaking to him directly. Nobody announced these changes, but everyone noticed them. Kindness has a way of making itself visible without asking for attention. My own routine remained much the same. I arrived before sunrise, completed my assignments, called Sophie during lunch, and returned home every evening to help with homework and bedtime stories. I never expected Nathan to become part of that world. One Saturday afternoon, however, Mrs. Calloway invited Sophie and me to the estate for the annual community picnic held on the back lawn. Families of every employee were welcome. Children chased colorful kites across the wide green field, while local musicians played cheerful songs beneath a white pavilion. Long tables overflowed with homemade desserts, fresh lemonade, and picnic baskets prepared by the kitchen staff. For the first time since I had accepted the housekeeping position, I saw the estate filled not with business executives, but with laughter. Sophie ran toward the face-painting booth before I could even remind her not to run too fast. I smiled and followed at a slower pace. A few minutes later, I found Nathan standing beside the lemonade table speaking with one of the maintenance supervisors. His sleeves were rolled neatly to his forearms, revealing the familiar tattoos that once seemed intimidating but now simply looked like another chapter of a story I had not yet fully read. He noticed Sophie proudly showing off a painted butterfly on her cheek. "That is impressive artwork," he said with a small smile. Sophie beamed. "Do you want one too?" I quietly apologized for the question, but Nathan surprised both of us. "Only if butterflies come in blue." Sophie laughed so hard she nearly spilled her lemonade. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a tiny paintbrush borrowed from the artist. With complete concentration, she carefully painted a small blue butterfly near Nathan's wrist, just beside the edge of one tattoo. Everyone nearby smiled as he remained perfectly still, allowing her to finish her masterpiece. When she stepped back to admire her work, he studied the tiny butterfly and said, "I believe this is the finest addition anyone has ever made to my collection." Sophie clapped happily before running off to join the other children. I looked at him with genuine surprise. "You did not have to do that." He watched Sophie disappear into the crowd before answering. "Yes, I did." His voice remained calm. "Children remember how adults make them feel. I would rather she remembers today than my first impression." We stood together watching families laugh beneath the afternoon sun. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Finally, he looked at me. "I know trust is earned slowly." I nodded. "It is. Then I will keep earning it one day at a time." I searched his face for the certainty I had once mistaken for pride. It had been replaced by something far quieter. Humility, growth, hope. For the first time since we met, I realized he was no longer asking me to see him differently. He was simply becoming someone worth seeing. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the oak trees surrounding the Calloway estate in shades of gold and amber. Nearly 3 months had passed since my first day, and somehow the mansion no longer felt like a place where I simply worked. It had become a place where people greeted one another by name, where laughter drifted through the kitchens more often than silence, and where even Nathan seemed lighter than the man I had first met beneath the grand staircase. Change had not happened because of one apology. It had happened because he chose, day after day, to become someone different when nobody expected him to. One Friday afternoon, Mrs. Calloway invited Sophie and me to the estate's annual harvest celebration, a tradition she said had been neglected for years. Families filled the gardens carrying homemade pies. Children played games beneath. Colorful ribbons tied between maple trees, and musicians performed cheerful songs while neighbors shared long picnic tables covered with autumn flowers. Sophie spent nearly an hour helping younger children decorate tiny pumpkins before running toward me with bright orange paint on the tip of her nose. "Mommy, look what I made." She proudly held up a pumpkin with a slightly crooked smile painted across the front. "It looks happy," I said. "Because smiling is contagious," she answered as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. I laughed and gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face. Across the garden, I noticed Nathan watching us with the quiet expression I had come to recognize. Not distant anymore. Peaceful. A few minutes later, he walked over carrying 2 cups of hot apple cider. He offered one to me before kneeling beside Sophie. "I believe your pumpkin has a better smile than mine ever could." Sophie studied him seriously before placing the tiny pumpkin into his hands. "Then you should keep it." He looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Mommy says presents mean more when you give your favorite one away." Nathan looked toward me, then back at the little pumpkin resting carefully in his hands. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he stood and quietly spoke the words I never expected to hear. "Grace, I spent years believing strength meant judging quickly and trusting slowly. You and Sophie taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." I waited patiently. He smiled with a humility that no longer seemed difficult for him. "You never needed to become someone different to deserve respect." I needed to become someone different to understand what respect really meant. My eyes filled before I could stop them. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No audience. No applause. Only truth. I stepped a little closer and gently took his hand. "People can change," I whispered, "but only when they choose honesty over pride." He nodded. "Thank you for giving me the chance to prove it." Before either of us spoke again, Sophie slipped between us and grabbed both of our hands at the same time. "Now nobody gets left behind," she announced happily. We laughed together as Mrs. Calloway watched from beneath the old oak tree with tears of quiet joy shining in her eyes. Nathan leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss against my forehead, not as a promise of perfection, but as a promise of respect. As the afternoon sun settled beyond the gardens and the laughter of families filled the cool autumn air, I finally understood something my daughter had known all along. The people who change your life are rarely the ones who tell you that you are beautiful. They are the ones who help you believe it again when you have forgotten it yourself.